I am just back from a week of study in Jerusalem. I was learning with Torah scholars and meeting with Israeli and Palestinian peace builders, wrestling with different interpretations of how we got to where we are today, and sharing and hearing different visions of where we might go from here. I watched the release of 11 chatufim, 11 hostages from up close, and witnessed the disastrous initial moves of this administration from a distance. While I was there, I re-encountered an idea that I first heard from Mika Almog 8 years ago. Mika is Shimon Peres's granddaughter, herself a fierce fighter for democracy and justice in Israel, who visited IKAR for Shabbat shortly after the 2016 elections, as some of you may recall. It was Mika who taught me about what was, at the time, a new cultural concept in Israeli society. Israelis were, she said, mishtablalim. They had taken to snailing. When a person tries to escape a harsh reality that is unfolding around them, they might curl up like snails into their shells and hide and wait. Eventually, the threat will pass, they think, and they will be able to reemerge. That image has stuck with me throughout these years. I can't do anything about this, the snail thinks, and so I shall curl up in a ball and pray that the storm passes quickly. I'm afraid that the phenomenon of snailing is contagious. It has made its way over the Atlantic and threatens now to become the posture of our time in this place too. And believe me, I understand the instinct. I too have been overwhelmed these past 3 weeks, which have felt like an eternity, by what, as Recline and others have pointed out, is a strategy to flood the zone, to overwhelm us with awful, so that we cannot effectively decipher between a genuine threat and a red herring. The very objective is fear, confusion, and demoralization. I promise you I will not stand up here every week for the next 4 years and laundry list every terrible thing that's happened that week. But just for a moment, I want you to consider this past week. The pursuit of immigrants, undocumented and documented, in ICE raids sweeping through cities across the nation. The paralyzing of programs and organizations like HIAS that are helping resettle refugees, including those arriving to this country with special immigrant visas, like the many Afghans who supported the US military in Afghanistan and their families, now left with no support. The evisceration of USAID, cruelly abandoning thousands of people around the world who have been taking experimental drugs for HIV, malaria, cervical cancer, under the care of clinical professionals who are now no longer allowed to monitor or support them because it is claimed that agency is wasteful and advances a liberal agenda. The fact that real live children, including some in our own community, are being threatened with having their gender-affirming care eliminated due to executive order, that many have already been denied receiving life-saving medical services. The astonishing articulation of a plan for US ownership of Gaza and the ethnic cleansing of an entire population of Palestinians, a stretching of the Overton window so dramatic, so dangerous, that I think it may have shattered the window altogether. The firing of what Timothy Snyder this week called the best people in American law enforcement, national security, and national intelligence. And lest we're unclear as to what the end game is here, Snyder himself is unambiguous. The aim is lawlessness, to get the police and the patriots out of the way. Of course, this is a coup, he writes. Miss the obvious and lose your republic. All of this is a campaign of shock and awe, and it will do untold damage to our nation, to our laws, to our bodies, and to our world. So yes, I understand the desire to snail. I can relate to the instinct to retreat, to try to avoid, evade, escape it all. And even still, there is no question that snailing is a profoundly un-Jewish posture, that it trades sacred discontent for self-righteous disconnect. Snailing may be tempting, but we must remember that it is not the answer. For one, a snail burrowed deeply into herself is unable to assess an approaching threat and therefore unable to protect herself from getting crushed. But snailing also preemptively abandons those who are weakest and most vulnerable to harm, who will undoubtedly be quashed first, and that is morally unconscionable. It may not be you or your community who today faces the greatest threat, but that does not mean that you have the right to ignore it. And don't believe that it won't be you tomorrow. And remember this, when an entire population snails in tandem, tyrants perceive that they have been granted the permission to run roughshod over us all. Snailing practices us in compliance, in capitulation, in surrender. It never makes things better. And yet, snailing is not the only posture that we have to be wary of in these difficult days. Listen to Parshat Beshalach. 3 days after Bnei Yisrael, exhausted and broken from hundreds of years of harsh oppression, left Mitzrayim, they stand now at the water's edge. The Egyptian army bounds toward them. They can hear the sounds of the hooves of the horses approaching, the screeching wheels of the chariots, the sounds of war. And before them, the black, stormy waters. The people, tormented, confused, and full of fear, are stuck. There is no escape. In the midst of this chaotic scene, the Mechilta envisions not one unified mass of Israelites and not 2 million scattered souls, but 4 distinct camps, 4 factions that have coalesced among the people, and 4 responses to crisis that persist even in our time. The first group of Israelites is terrified. The forces bearing down on them are so threatening that all they want to do is dive into the sea, wrap themselves up in the dark waters, bury themselves in the deep, out of reach of this hostile world. They want to snail. This is a kind of death. At the other extreme is a second faction, those who, in the face of grave danger, determine that maybe actually Egypt wasn't so bad after all. They're so scared that they will justify, excuse, they will fully contort themselves and their values to align with the pharaohs who wield power in this world. A third faction tries to rally the troops. Better to kill than be killed. They meet hostility with hostility, turning themselves into a mirror image of their opponents. And the fourth faction simply breaks down and weeps. They feel completely powerless, stuck. They are stymied, they are frozen. 4 factions, 4 responses to an all-out assault on our values, a threat to our loved ones, and potentially to our lives. None of these is the right path, says the Lubavitcher Rebbe. So what then are we to do when confronted with a hostile world or threatened by a tyrant, or when every one of our core values or our lives themselves are threatened? Daber al b'nei Yisrael v'yisa'u. Tell the children of Israel to go forward. Do not try to escape the reality. Do not submit to the reality. Do not wage war on this reality, and for God's sake, do not do nothing. Go forward. In the language of the Rebbe, it's do another mitzvah. Ignite another soul. Sometimes that is literally all we can do. We have to remember that the tyrant's goal is to sow chaos, to create a sense of overwhelm that is so profound that the people are left only with a feeling of utter inevitability. But here's what we know. Nothing, literally nothing in this world is inevitable. We do not tell and retell the story of a people hemmed in at the very edge of the sea with a raging army in pursuit so that we learn surrender the moment that challenge emerges. There's always another way. My friend Rachel Levin, this week, told me the story of a very famous photo of a yogi performing a handstand right at the edge of a deep canyon in India amidst El Nino-like winds. Some of you may have seen this photo. His student is stunned and says to him, "How did you do that? Weren't you afraid?" And the yogi responds with 2 words, unknown, known. Unknown, known. By which he means when you are in an unknowable situation, do what you know. Get centered, straighten out, and control what you can control. In the language of the Lubavitcher Rabbi, do a mitzvah and ignite another soul. In the face of the unknown of our time, we too, individually and collectively, must do what we know. There is so much unknown today. We cannot predict which one of these edicts will survive legal challenges and which will be reversed, which threats will be realized, and which serve only to scare and distract and confuse. Whether or not a few people of conscience in the Senate will be willing to oppose their party to save their country, we just do not know. But we must do what we do know. And what we do know is tenderness. So today, we must make our lives a testament to the power of tenderness, even in the face of tyranny. We must turn to one another with grace, with patience, and with compassion. What we do know is how to sing together, and how to cry together, and how to laugh, and how to dance. We must do all of that, even in the face of grave threats. We must nurture our spirits, even as we use our voices and our bodies to protect one another. What we do know is how to write comedy, and how to make art, and how to tell stories. We know how to teach children, and how to help them feel safe, even when fires are burning, and viruses are raging, and war is looming. We know how to do that, and that is what we must do. What we do know is how to resist. Each of us must do what we can, each of us in our own corner, to gunk up the works. Not simply to bandage the wounds of the victims beneath the wheels of injustice, as Bonhoeffer wrote, but to drive a spoke into the wheel itself. In the days ahead, some of us will have the opportunity to do this from within the system, and some of us from without. Some of us in the opinion pages, some of us from pulpits, some of us in small groups and quiet ways, and some of us with loud voices before large crowds. Some in our homes, and some in the streets. All of us, every one of us, must become the embodiment of conscience. We heard it first here from a bar mitzvah boy today. What we do know is how to tell the truth, and that we must do. What we do know is how to use words, and the words that we use now matter, maybe even more than ever before. And we must protect and persist in saying the soft words, the tender words, words like peace, and words like hope. What we do know is how to dream, and we must continue to dream an alternative moral horizon, to articulate a different vision. Because I'm telling you now that there will be a time when we are no longer in peril, when Pharaoh's chariots are no longer in pursuit, when we have made it to the other shore, and when we arrive there and Marnina and Micah take out their timbrels, when we look up and we assess our losses and we bandage our wounds, we will need to know that even in the face of the great unknown, we, every single one of us, did everything in our power to hold fast to what we do know. And what we know is faith. And what we know is humanity. And what we know is hope. And what we know is love. Shabbat Shalom.